The frostwood arena was carved from winter itself. The tiered seating was hewn directly from the jagged, glacial rock of the surrounding mountains, the stone so cold it seemed to steal the very breath from the lungs of anyone who dared to stand upon it. Frost clung to the edges of the spectator benches like jagged teeth, biting into the flesh of the pack. Torches sputtered and hissed along the high, imposing walls, their flames burning a weak, sickly blue against the overwhelming, oppressive chill of the mountain air. The atmosphere was thick, heavy with the primal, suffocating scent of damp fur, roasted meat, and the metallic tang of bloodlust and anticipation. Thousands of lichens filled the stands, their broad shoulders pressed tightly together, their golden amber and crimson eyes glowing menacingly in the gloom. They were all fixed on the center of the crushed ice, waiting for a spectacle. Elowen Vance stood in the middle of that frozen ring. She didn't know the winter equinox mating trials were designed specifically to break her. She didn't know. The whispers in the dark corridors of the packhouse had already sealed her fate long before the sun had risen, and she definitely didn't know that the very thing they mocked as an unforgivable weakness was the ancient, slumbering power that would eventually bring them all to their knees. All she knew was the biting, relentless cold of the arena ice seeping through the thin, worn leather soles of her boots, creeping up her calves like a physical shackle. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to let her teeth chatter. The cold was a weapon here, but Elowen had learned long ago that silence was a far greater shield. She wore a simple, unadorned grey tunic, her dark hair braided tightly against her scalp. Around her neck hung a delicate silver thread amulet, suppressing the strange heat in her blood. It rested heavily over her collarbone, a cold, unyielding reminder of the bindings the pack elders had placed upon her as a child. Hidden inside her boot was her only other possession, a moonstone dagger, a sacred blade used for self-defense against dark magic. She had spent her entire life trying to shrink, trying to be invisible so that the predators around her would pass her by. She had learned to walk without making a sound, to breathe without moving her chest. But today, invisibility was not an option. The heavy iron-wrought gates at the northern end of the arena groaned open. The crowd erupted into low, rumbling growls of approval. Nadia Belrose stepped onto the ice. The highborn Omega did not just enter a room. She commanded it. Nadia glided across the frozen floor, draped in the pristine, heavy pelts of a dozen snow leopards. The silver clasps of her cloak caught the weak torchlight, flashing like tiny warning blades in the dark. Her scent hit the arena floor before she did, an overpowering, cloying mixture of crushed nightshade and heavy, sweet musk that made Elowen's stomach twist. But she kept her spine straight and her breathing shallow. Nadia paused a few feet away, a cruel, perfectly practiced smile pulling at her painted lips. The arena quieted. Thousands of spectators leaned forward, practically salivating for the humiliation to come. This was the opening ceremony, the ritual proving of the weak. Observe it. Nadia's voice rang out, clear and sharp, like cracking ice. She didn't address Elowen. She addressed the crowd. She addressed the throne high above, a wolfless defect. She stands on the sacred ice of our ancestors, as if she possesses a drop of worthy blood in those brittle veins. The crowd chuckled, a low, rolling sound that vibrated through the soles of Elowen's feet. 20 years old, Nadia continued, taking a slow, predatory circle around her. Her heavy fur cloak brushed against Elowen's bare forearms, leaving a trail of icy static, and still no wolf, no scent of a mate, just a human shell eating the meat our hunters bleed for. You soil the winter equinox mating trials just by breathing the air, Elowen. Elowen did not blink. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight. You are nothing, Nadia whispered, leaning in so only Elowen could hear the venom in her tone. When the wolves tear you apart in the crags, not a single soul in this arena will mourn. The king won't even remember your name. Elowen's expression remained entirely blank. She didn't need him to remember her name. She only needed to survive. Look at me, Nadia hissed, her voice dropping into a dangerous, commanding register meant to force a weaker wolf to bare their throat. Elowen did not move. Her heart maintained a steady, slow rhythm. 1 beat, 2 beats. She would not submit. She was not a wolf, but she was not prey. Nadia's eyes flashed with sudden, spiteful rage. She raised a hand, her long manicured nails sharpened to points, and struck Elowen across the cheek. The crack of flesh against flesh echoed sharply in the cavernous silence of the arena. Eowyn's head snapped to the side. A hot bloom of pain erupted across her cheekbone, followed instantly by the coppery taste of blood in her mouth. The blow was meant to send her to her knees. It was meant to make her weep, to beg for mercy, to scramble in the crushed ice like a pathetic, frightened human. Instead, she stood perfectly still. She slowly turned her head back to center. Her storm-grey eyes locked onto Nadia's furious gaze. There were no tears in Eowyn's eyes, only a vast, terrifying emptiness that made the high-born Omega instinctively take a half-step backward. Eowyn did not raise a hand to wipe the blood from her lip. She let it drip. A bright, startling crimson against her pale skin. Above them, seated on a massive throne of black iron and glacial ice, King Silas watched. The Alpha King was a monument of lethal stillness. He did not lean forward like the rest of the pack. He did not sneer, nor did he cheer for the cruelty unfolding on the ice below. He simply watched, his eyes like molten gold, burning through the frigid gloom of the arena. King Silas carried the weight of the third age of the Lycan Empire on his broad, armored shoulders. His power was a physical pressure in the room, an aura so dense and suffocating that even the torches closest to the royal box seemed to cower and dim in his presence. He was the absolute sovereign, he was the Winter, and he was bound by unyielding oaths. The ancient trial law was sacred. No Alpha, not even the king, could intervene in the proving rings. To step onto the ice to defend a participant was to declare them permanently unfit for the pack, a death sentence of exile. So King Silas sat with his hands resting casually on the armrests of his throne, his face an impenetrable mask of cold indifference. But beneath the surface, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jabbed beneath his skin. The scent of Eowyn's blood drifted up to the royal box, a single agonizingly sweet drop in a sea of foulness. It hit his senses like a physical blow. His chest tightened. A hollow ache, a remnant of a curse he had carried in silence for years, suddenly flared to life. He did not know why this wolfless girl's blood made his own wolf snarl in his mind, clawing at the bars of his ribcage, demanding violence. He did not know she carried the ancient magic of his ancestors' oldest allies. He watched her endure the strike without a single flinch. He watched her refuse to break. Not weak, his wolf rumbled in the dark recesses of his mind. Never weak. But King Silas didn't intervene. He couldn't, because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome, and breaking the sacred laws of the Lycan Empire would bring a war that the Frostwood Pack was not ready to fight. The Wolfless are the first to enter the Whispering Crags, the High Priest announced, his voice booming over the magical amplifiers carved into the stone. They will act as the Pathfinders. The Alphas will follow. The hunt begins at the sounding of the horn. Nadia smiled a sickly, venomous smile at Eowyn. Let's see how long you last in the crags, little human. The rogues are hungry this year. Eowyn finally looked away from Nadia, her gaze sweeping past the jeering crowds, past the sneering faces of the pack members she had grown up with. She didn't seek pity from the throne, she simply turned her back on the Omega, ignoring Nadia's outraged gasp, and walked toward the northern gates. The heavy iron portcullis was slowly rising, revealing the jagged, snow-choked maw of the Whispering Crags. A deep, bone-rattling blast from a war horn shattered the air. The winter equinox mating trials had begun. Eowyn stepped out of the arena and into the brutal wilderness. The transition from the artificial cold of the Frostwood arena to the raw, untamed fury of the Whispering Crags was violent. The wind howled through the narrow mountain passes like dying animals, whipping snow and ice crystals into the air. The terrain was a nightmare of treacherous ravines, razor-sharp obsidian rocks, and deep, deceptive snowdrifts that could swallow a Lycan whole. She pulled her thin grey tunic tighter around her body, her breath plumbing in white clouds in front of her face. The cold was absolute. It bit through her clothes, sinking into her bones, numbing her fingers and toes. But she did not stop. She pushed forward, her worn boots crunching against the icy crust of the snow. She reached into her boot and retrieved the moonstone dagger. The handle was cold, wrapped in rough leather, but it grounded her. The sacred blade glowed with a faint, pearlescent light in the shadows of the crags. It was her only defense against the horrors that lurked in the dark. Eowyn navigated the treacherous path with practiced care. She stayed downwind, her movements fluid and silent. She rubbed pine needles and crushed frostberries against her skin, masking her scent. She avoided the wide open snowfields, sticking close to the shadows of the towering cliffs. An hour passed, then 2. The sky above the crags darkened, transitioning from a pale, bruised grey to a deep, ominous violet. The temperature plummeted further. Every breath felt like inhaling shattered glass. The silver thread amulet around her neck grew heavier, an icy stone pressing into her chest, restraining the heat that lay dormant deep within her core. Sometimes, in the dead of winter, Elowen felt an impossible warmth stirring in her blood, a golden light pressing against the seams of her skin, demanding release. But the amulet always held it back, a cursed gift from the elders, who feared what they could not understand. She paused beneath the overhang of a massive, frozen waterfall, leaning her back against the ice-slicked rock to catch her breath. Her legs were trembling from the exertion. The cut on her cheek from Nadia's strike had frozen shut, a thin line of dried blood pulling painfully at her skin. Silence. The wind died down for a brief, fleeting second. In that silence, Elowen heard it, a sound that made her heart stop. It was faint, almost swallowed by the vast emptiness of the mountain. A wet, ragged gasp, the unmistakable sound of a body dragging itself across jagged rocks, and then a whimper, a high, reedy sound of absolute terror and pain, a pup. Elowen's grip tightened on the moonstone dagger. The cardinal rule of the treacherous mountain was simple: never deviate from the path, and never investigate a cry. Rogues often used mimicry to lure their prey, but the whimper came again, followed by a weak, frantic scratching sound. It wasn't a trap. It was the sound of a desperate, dying creature. Elowen didn't hesitate. The survival instinct that had kept her invisible for 20 years vanished, replaced instantly by a fierce, undeniable urge to protect. She pushed away from the ice wall and moved toward the sound, her boots silent on the snow. She rounded a sharp bend in the canyon, the rock walls narrowing into a claustrophobic ravine. At the bottom of the crevasse, trapped between 2 massive boulders, lay Valen Thorn. The young royal wolf pup was barely conscious. His usually pristine silver-grey fur was matted with thick, dark blood. A brutal, jagged tear ran down his flank, exposing raw muscle. He was trapped, his back leg pinned beneath a fallen slab of ice. His tiny chest he heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. The spiritual aura of his royal lineage, a faint, luminescent silver mist that usually surrounded the high-born young, was flickering weakly, on the verge of extinguishing entirely. Elowen dropped to her knees, sliding down the steep incline of the ravine. She didn't care that her hands were scraped raw by the ice. She didn't care that the scent of the pup's blood would undoubtedly draw every predator in a 5-mile radius. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice cracking in the freezing air. She shoved the moonstone dagger back into her boot and reached out with both hands. Valen flinched at her approach, baring his tiny teeth in a desperate, weak snarl. His golden eyes were clouded with pain. "Shh, brave one, I know it hurts." Elowen kept her voice low, a soothing, melodic hum. She didn't try to touch his wound. Instead, she wedged her hands into the narrow gap beneath the fallen ice slab pinning his leg. The ice was impossibly heavy. Elowen braced her boots against the rock wall, gritting her teeth as she pushed upward with all her strength. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her joints popped. The cold bit into her exposed fingers, threatening frostbite, but she refused to let go. She pushed until she tasted blood in the back of her throat. With a sickening crunch, the ice shifted, just enough. Valen scrambled backward, his whimpers turning into a sharp cry of agony as his mangled leg pulled free. He collapsed against Elowen's chest, shivering violently. Elowen immediately wrapped her arms around the pup, pulling him tightly against her own freezing body, trying to share whatever meager body heat she had left. Valen whined, burying his wet, blooded snout into the crook of her neck. "I have you," Elowen murmured, her hands trembling as she stroked his matted fur. "You're safe. We just have to." A shadow fell over the ravine. The temperature in the crevasse dropped so suddenly that the moisture on Elowen's eyelashes froze solid. The air grew thick, suffocating, reeking of rotting meat and dark, corrupted magic. Elowen slowly looked up. Standing at the lip of the ravine, blocking the only exit, was Garrick Vane. The rogue was massive, easily twice the size of a normal lichen. He was not just a wolf. He was a nightmare carved from shadow and fury. His fur was patchy, exposing scarred, grey skin that seemed to seep a black, smoky miasma. His eyes were entirely black, devoid of pupils or sclera, consumed by the forbidden magic that had driven him mad. Dark saliva dripped from his bared fangs, hissing as it hit the snow. Garrick let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the rock walls, shaking loose small avalanches of snow. He had caught the scent of royal blood, and he had found his prey. Elowen's breath hitched. She tightened her grip on Valen, pulling the shivering pup securely behind her back. She slowly rose to her feet, placing her body between the rogue and the defenseless child. She reached down and pulled the moonstone dagger from her boot. High above them, standing on the treacherous cliffs overlooking the ravine, King Silas arrived. He had tracked Elowen's scent the moment the horn blew. He had bypassed the other participants, scaling the sheer rock faces with terrifying speed, driven by an instinct he refused to name. He stood on the precipice, looking down into the crevasse, accompanied by a dozen elite pack sentinels. King Silas saw the massive rogue, he saw the bleeding royal pup, and he saw the wolfless girl standing alone in the snow, holding a tiny dagger against a monster that could snap her in half with a single bite. My king, the captain of the sentinels, breathed, stepping forward, his hand dropping to his sword hilt. The rogue, "It's Garrick, we must intervene. Valen will be slaughtered." King Silas didn't move. His golden eyes were fixed on Elowen. The ancient trial law bound his hands with invisible iron. To intervene in the proving grounds, even to save a royal pup, meant violating the sacred treaty of the trials. It would dissolve his right to rule. It would plunge the pack into chaos. His wolf screamed at him to jump, to tear the rogue's throat out, to shield the girl in the grey tunic. But the king stood still as a statue carved from ice. He didn't intervene. Down in the ravine, Elowen kept her vision lowered from the cliffs. She knew they were there. She could feel the crushing weight of King Silas's gaze pressing down on her. She knew the rules. No one was coming to save her. She looked at the massive rogue preparing to leap, wolfless, defect, weak. Nadia's words echoed in her mind. Elowen didn't beg. She didn't scream for the king to break his laws. She simply reached up, curled her fingers around the silver thread amulet at her throat, and ripped it off. The chain snapped. The delicate silver threads of her amulet hit the jagged ice at her feet and shattered into a dozen pieces. Instantly, the oppressive, suffocating cold of the ravine vanished. A wave of pure, blistering heat exploded from Elowen's chest. The shockwave hit the rock walls with the force of a physical blow, vaporizing the snow and melting the ice in a wide, perfect circle around her and the injured pup. The golden light that had been suppressed for 20 years tore through the seams of her flesh, radiating out in a blinding, incandescent corona of ancient sunborn magic. Her dark hair lifted, floating in the sudden, superheated updraft. Her storm-grey eyes burned away, turning into pools of molten liquid gold. Garrick recoiled, his corrupted shadow magic hissing and smoking as the light hit him. The monster that had terrified the icy wastelands let out a shriek of pure agony, his black eyes boiling in his skull. The rogue lunged anyway, a desperate mass of snapping jaws and corrupted shadows. Elowen didn't flinch. She swung the moonstone dagger. The sacred blade carved through the air like a weapon forged from a falling star, leaving a trailing arc of golden fire in its wake. The light slammed into Garrick's chest, burning away the darkness that had consumed his mind, throwing the massive beast backward into the snow. High on the cliff, King Silas stumbled back, shielding his face from the blinding light. The bond snapped into place like a key turning in a lock. A river of liquid silver flooded his veins. The bone-deep chill of his curse, the frost that had encased his lungs for a decade, seared away in an instant. It was a violent, molten thawing. He felt the pure heat radiating from the ravine floor, climbing the jagged cliffs to wrap around his throat. The black iron of his armor, usually biting cold against his skin, suddenly became feverishly warm. He breathed in, and the winter air did not freeze his chest. It tasted of ember and dawn. For the first time in his life, the king felt warm. He watched her stand her ground, a blazing inferno of ancient power, and he realized with sickening clarity that he had just watched his fated mate walk into a death trap, and he had done absolutely nothing to stop it. The word thundered through their bond like a war drum. Mine. Elowen refused to glance at the king. She paid no mind to the shocked sentinels or the whispering crowds. She kept her focus entirely on the shivering pup in her arms, nursing him with the gentle warmth of her newly unleashed magic. The golden light radiating from Elowen Vance slowly began to recede, drawing back into her skin like a setting sun sinking beneath the horizon. The oppressive, unnatural cold of the jagged ravines remained completely banished from the immediate circle around her. The ice beneath her boots had melted into a shallow pool of warm water, reflecting the lingering, incandescent glow of her mesmerizing gaze. Her attention never drifted toward the towering cliffs. She did not cast her gaze toward the Alpha King or the elite sentinels who stood paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Her entire universe had narrowed down to the small, shivering body of Valen Thorn. The young royal wolf pup lay motionless in her lap. Elowen pressed her bare, blood-stained hands gently against his matted fur. The ancient magic, untethered for the first time in 20 years since the lunar talisman had been locked around her neck, flowed from her palms in a steady, rhythmic pulse. The physical sensation was staggering. For 2 decades, she had lived with a hollow ache, a frozen cage locked directly over her sternum. Now the cage was utterly shattered. Liquid heat poured through her veins, a rushing river of pure, molten warmth that tasted of summer rain and crushed ember. It was not a violent force anymore. It was a deep, resonating hearth fire on the darkest night of winter. She felt the magic sinking through his skin, knitting the torn muscle of his flank back together, sealing the jagged wound left by Garrick Vane's vicious ambush. The physical exertion was immense. Her muscles trembled under the strain. Her lungs burned as she forced the ambient magic of the crags to bend to her will. Sweat beaded at her temples, instantly turning to steam in the frigid air, but she refused to falter. Valen's shallow, erratic breaths gradually deepened, transforming into a steady, peaceful rhythm. The luminescent silver mist of his spiritual aura, which had been flickering dangerously on the verge of death, suddenly flared to life. It rose from his fur and wrapped around Elowen's wrists in a gentle, ethereal embrace, acknowledging her as its savior. In that quiet, intimate moment, the physical world seemed to fall away entirely. As Elowen's ancient magic mingled with the pup's royal lineage, a sudden, sharp pressure bloomed behind her eyes. It was not a spoken voice, but a visceral rush of cold dread and fragmented thoughts projecting directly into her mind. Valen was communicating. The defenseless pup possessed a spiritual sensitivity far beyond his years, and through the bridge of her healing light, he shared his absolute terror. Elowen gasped softly, her eyelids fluttering shut against the immense psychological strain. The vision slammed into her with brutal, undeniable force. She saw flashes of the deep woods, distorted by a pup's terrified perspective. She tasted the foul, metallic tang of corrupted blood on the wind. She saw enormous shadows moving fluidly through the snow, countless pairs of blood-red and pitch-black eyes gleaming in the suffocating dark. Garrick Vane had not been hunting alone. The corrupted rogue was merely the vanguard of a much larger, far more organized nightmare. A rising tide of monstrous rogue wolves was gathering in the northern ridges, their unnatural silence thick with the promise of slaughter. They were preparing to sweep down into the Frostwood territory in a coordinated strike. The sacred Frostwood arena grounds were completely compromised. Valen's fear washed over her in freezing, jagged waves, a desperate, primal warning of the rising threat that intended to massacre every participant left in the mountains. "I see them," she whispered, her voice a soothing, rumbling vibration against the pup's resting head. She pushed back his icy dread with her newfound, blazing warmth, wrapping a mental shield of golden light around his fragile consciousness. "I see them, brave one. You do not have to carry this fear anymore. I will not let them touch you." High above, standing on the treacherous precipice overlooking the ravine, King Silas Frostwood was fighting a devastating war inside his own body. The fated mate bond had ignited with the force of a catastrophic earthquake. The golden connection tying his soul to the wolfless girl below was vibrating so violently, it felt as though his ribs were cracking apart, splintering under the immense pressure of their sudden, undeniable link. For a decade, he had carried an ancient winter curse, a localized blizzard buried deep inside his chest that turned his every breath into shattered glass and froze his emotions into unfeeling stone. Now that frost was entirely eradicated, in its place was a searing, desperate heat, It was a primal, gut-wrenching demand that screams at him to leap down the rock face, to wrap his massive arms around her, to shield her from the biting wind and the cruelty of the world. His eyes, burning with liquid amber fire, were locked onto Elowen. The realization that he had sat on his throne of black iron, bound by archaic laws, casually watching his own mate endure public humiliation, struck him with a sickening, physical wave of nausea. He had allowed Nadia to strike her in front of the entire pack. He had permitted the High Priest to send her into a death trap under the guise of the sacred winter equinox trials. He had followed her unique scent to the edge of this cliff and stood perfectly still while a massive, shadow-corrupted rogue prepared to tear her throat out. Claim her, his inner beast snarled, clawing frantically at the edges of his control, threatening to completely take over his human consciousness. Protect her, destroy anyone who looks at her. Silas took a half step forward, the thick snow crunching loudly beneath his heavy armored boots. The urge to drop directly into the ravine was blinding, an instinct so powerful his muscles locked in preparation for the descent. But the captain of the sentinels cleared his throat, a sharp, cautious sound that brought the king crashing painfully back to reality. The ancient decrees, the sacred treaties. A sovereign who broke the foundational rules of the trials would plunge his entire empire into a bloody civil war before the sun rose. He was a king before he was a protector. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the pommel of his broadsword, a physical manifestation of the agony tearing his soul in half. Down in the crevasse, Elowen finally stood. Her legs shook slightly from the massive expenditure of magic, but she locked her knees, refusing to show weakness. She gathered Valen carefully into her arms, tucking the sleeping pup inside the folds of her heavy grey tunic to shield him from the biting wind that was beginning to creep back into the ravine. She didn't spare a single glance upward. She didn't seek the king's approval or the sentinel's awe. She simply turned her back on the precipice, carrying the royal heir deeper into the jagged labyrinth of the whispering crags, moving toward an abandoned border outpost she had spotted earlier on her descent. The ruins of the old garrison sat huddled against the base of a sheer granite cliff, half swallowed by massive snowdrifts and the creeping shadows of the ancient pines. Elowen stepped through the crumbling stone archway, moving out of the howling wind and into the relative stillness of the dilapidated structure. The roof had partially caved in decades ago, but the back corner offered a dry, sheltered alcove. She moved with quiet purpose, driven by a maternal instinct she had never fully understood until this very moment. She gathered dried moss, fallen pine needles, and the remnants of discarded military wool to create a soft, insulated nest on the cold stone floor. She laid Valen down with infinite care, her hands lingering on his silver-grey fur to ensure his core temperature remained stable against the freezing rock. The pup let out a soft, contented sigh, his spiritual aura glowing steadily in the gloom, casting a faint silver luminescence over the walls. A sudden, drastic shift in the air pressure made the fine hairs on the back of Elowen's neck stand up. The temperature in the ruin plummeted instantaneously, not from the changing weather, but from the overwhelming, suffocating aura of an alpha predator entering a confined space. She turned slowly, her protective instincts flaring as she instinctively dropped her hand to the hilt of her moonstone dagger, ready to defend the pup with her life. King Silas stood in the crumbling doorway, his massive frame completely blocking out the pale violet light of the winter sky. He had descended from the cliffs, unable to resist the magnetic pull of their connection for another agonizing second. Behind him, the shadows shifted as his elite guards fanned out silently to secure the perimeter of the outpost, and pushing aggressively past the guards, draped in her pristine, ridiculous snow leopard pelts, was Nadia Belrose. The highborn Omega had trailed the royal retinue, desperate to witness the aftermath of the Frostwood arena rites and ensure her rival was dead. Silas stepped into the ruin. He didn't look at the sleeping pup. He didn't look at the collapsed roof, the ancient stones, or the frost clinging to the walls. His gaze of scorched gold fixed entirely, obsessively on Elowen. As he drew nearer, the physical sensations of the soul bond flared wildly, a kinetic energy arcing between them. Elowen felt a sudden, sharp prickling heat along her collarbone, where the lunar talisman used to rest, a phantom burn marking the exact spot of her former captivity. Her heart executed a painful, stuttering rhythm against her ribs, struggling to maintain its pace in the presence of its true counterpart. Silas stopped less than 3 feet away. The sheer size of him, the dark, blood-stained iron of his armor, and the raw, unadulterated power radiating from his skin should have made her cower. Any other Omega would have dropped to the floor, baring their neck in immediate submission. Instead, she kept her spine perfectly straight, her steel-colored eyes meeting his burning gaze with cold, unbroken dignity. The king breathed in. The harsh, erratic sound of his inhalation echoed loudly in the quiet stone chamber. He noticed a strange, undeniable shift in her scent. Earlier in the arena, she had smelled of fear, frozen blood, and the bitter pine needles she deliberately used to mask her presence from the bullies. Now, stripped of her magical bindings, she smelled of something entirely different. It was an intoxicating, overwhelming fragrance of ancient cedar, crushed ember, and the exact moment the dawn breaks over a snowy horizon. It hit Silas like a physical blow to the chest, driving the oxygen from his lungs. His hands, clad in thick black leather gauntlets, twitched violently at his sides. He wanted to reach out. He wanted to trace the elegant line of her jaw, to wipe away the dried blood from the strike he had failed to prevent, to bury his face in her neck and inhale her essence. "You," Silas began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated through the very soles of Elowen's boots. It was a voice stripped of its royal detachment, filled instead with a desperate, agonizing hunger. Elowen did not flinch. She did not offer him a smile of relief or a desperate plea for safety. She merely tilted her chin upward, her expression a mask of perfect, icy indifference. "The pup is stable, King Silas," she stated softly, her tone completely devoid of the reverence owed to a monarch, deliberately ignoring the heavy implication of his words. "He requires rest." Before Silas could speak again, a sharp, indignant scoff shattered the fragile tension. Nadia pushed her way to the king's side. Her perfectly painted lips curled into a sneer of pure venom. She took one look at Elowen's glowing hands, the melted snow pooling around her boots, and the sleeping royal pup, and her face contorted with ugly, jealous rage. "Treason," Nadia hissed, her voice shrill and grating against the ancient stone walls. She used forbidden sorcery in the sacred arena bounds. The ancient edicts strictly forbid the use of unblessed magic. She must be exiled immediately, King Silas. She has tainted the sacred rites. Elowen watched the Alpha King. She waited for him to bend to the archaic laws. She waited for him to prioritize the political stability of his pack over the life she had just saved. She had spent 20 years being punished by this empire for simply existing. She fully expected to be punished again, because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome. But Silas did not look away from Elowen. The air in the ruined outpost grew unnaturally, terrifyingly still. A heavy, oppressive weight slammed down upon the room. The ambient temperature dropped so violently and rapidly that thick, crystalline frost began to actively crawl up the jagged stone walls, snapping and crackling in the dead silence. The drop in temperature wasn't weather. It was pure, concentrated alpha fury bleeding out of the king's pores. Frost instantly formed on the edges of Nadia's extravagant fur coat, her breath pluming into white clouds of sudden, visceral panic. The king's wolf was thrashing wildly against its mental restraints, demanding he tear the throat out of anyone who dared to threaten his newly discovered mate. Outside the archway, the terrifying shift in atmospheric pressure forced the elite guards to their knees. The physical weight of Silas's rage was so crushing that grown men in heavy iron armor gasped for oxygen, their lungs compressed by the sheer magnitude of their sovereign's wrath. "The High Council will demand an execution if you do not exile her now." Nadia pressed, foolishly emboldened by the king's silence, entirely misreading the deadly shift in the room. Her voice trembled against the unnatural cold as she stepped closer, placing a presumptuous hand on his armored forearm. "The Frostwood Arena demands blood for broken rules. You cannot protect a wolfless cheat who violates the sacred decree. We must return to the arena. She is not worth your time." Silas looked down at the hand resting on his arm. Slowly, dangerously, he shifted his gaze to Nadia's face. The amber fire in his eyes had turned into a hollow, dead stare of impending violence. "Treason," Silas repeated. The word did not sound like a question. It sounded like an executioner's axe dragging across cold stone. Nadia swallowed hard, her bravado shattering completely as the full, crushing weight of his aura slammed directly into her chest. She choked, staggering back as if she had been physically struck, her eyes wide and bloodshot. Yes, my king, the law is clear. She broke the bindings. The law Silas took a slow, deliberate step toward the Omega, the stone floor literally cracking beneath his boot, forcing her to stumble backward until her spine hit the freezing rock wall. Requires every participant to face the trials with honor. It requires the strong to protect the weak. Where were you, Nadia, when Garrick Vane breached the perimeter? Nadia's eyes widened in sudden, stark terror. Her chest heaved as she struggled to pull air into her frozen lungs, the realization of her fatal error finally dawning on her. I was seeking the sentinels. I was going for help. Lie. The single word cracked through the ruins like a thunderbolt, shaking dust from the collapsed ceiling. You ran. You left a defenseless pup of royal blood to be slaughtered. You stood in the Frostwood arena and mocked a woman you deemed weak, only to flee like a coward while she faced a corrupted rogue entirely alone. Silas, please, you will address me as King Silas, he snarled, his lips pulling back to reveal elongated canines. His voice dropped to a demonic, vibrating register that vibrated the very foundations of the old garrison, forcing Nadia to her knees as her body involuntarily submitted to the Alpha command. Or you will not speak at all. Silence, heavy, suffocating, absolute silence. The elite sentinels stationed outside the archway remained rigidly pinned to the snow, their heads bowed low, their hands gripping the hilts of their swords in terrifying anticipation. Silas turned his massive back on the cowering Omega, refusing to grant her another ounce of his attention. He looked back at Elowen, his amber eyes burning with a fierce protective fire that made her breath catch in her throat. He was not a prisoner to the system anymore. He was the system, and he was tearing it down for her. The punishment for cowardice in the face of a rogue attack is absolute, Silas declared, his voice carrying out into the freezing valleys for every sentinel to witness. By the authority of the third age of the Lycan Empire, Nadia Belrose is stripped of her rank. She is stripped of her titles. She is exiled from the Frostwood Pack, effective immediately. Nadia let out a strangled, hysterical sob, her perfectly manicured nails clawing uselessly at the icy stone floor. No, you cannot do this. The Council, my family. Your family will watch you walk into the frozen wastes, Silas said coldly, without looking at her. He flicked a single, dismissive hand toward the doorway. Take her. Remove her from my sight. If she crosses the borders of my territory again, she is to be executed on sight. 2 elite sentinels pushed themselves up from the snow instantly. They did not hesitate. They grabbed Nadia by her arms, dragging the thrashing, screaming Omega out of the ruins and into the biting storm. Her shrill cries faded rapidly into the howling wind, leaving behind a sudden, profound quiet in the garrison. Elowen was entirely oblivious that the Alpha King could command such ruthless, unhesitating justice. It never occurred to her that the sight of her bleeding hands had nearly driven his wolf insane, and she certainly had no idea that he was fully prepared to burn the entire empire to ash to keep her safe. All she knew was the sudden, overwhelming heat radiating from the massive man standing before her. The sun was finally beginning to set, the pale violet sky above the labyrinth of the cursed range. The sky above shifted, bleeding into deep, violent shades of bruised purple and burning gold. Shafts of dying sunlight filtered through the collapsed roof of the garrison, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and casting long, dramatic shadows across the stone floor. Silas closed the distance between them. 3 steps. 2. He stopped, just outside of her reach. He wanted to pull her against his chest. He wanted to bury his face in her dark hair and inhale the scent of his mate. But he didn't. He kept his hands at his sides, his fists clenched so tightly the leather of his gauntlets groaned in protest. He knew that taking what wasn't freely given would only destroy them both. He was a king, but in this moment he was a beggar. I was blind, Silas breathed, the words tearing out of his throat like rusted blades. I sat on that throne bound by edicts written by dead men, and I watched you bleed. I watched them mock you, and I did nothing. Elowen kept her chin raised, holding her ground. You obeyed the law, King Silas. As a sovereign must, I was a coward. The devastating admission hit the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. The sentinels stationed outside the archway shifted uncomfortably, completely shocked by the raw, bleeding honesty of their king. An alpha never admitted fault. A king never showed weakness, yet here he stood, voluntarily stripping himself of all armor. I let the fear of a fractured empire blind me to the only thing that actually mattered, Silas continued, his voice dropping into a broken rasp, his glowing eyes searching hers for any sign of mercy. I watched my fated mate face a monster alone. I watched you shatter the lunar talisman to save a life I abandoned. Elowen's breath hitched. The word thundered through their bond like a war drum, making the blood rush in her ears. A river of liquid silver warmth surged between them, confirming the truth she had felt the moment the bindings fell. I do not ask for your forgiveness, Silas said slowly, his voice laced with absolute devotion. I do not deserve it. But I will spend every remaining breath in my lungs, proving that you will never be left to fight alone again. Then the Alpha King moved. He did not reach for her. He did not issue a command. Silas Frostwood, the most feared predator in the Lycan Empire, sank to the cold stone floor. He went down on one knee, his heavy black iron armor clanking loudly against the granite. He bowed his dark head, exposing the vulnerable nape of his neck to her in a display of absolute, irreversible submission. Outside the ruined doorway, a synchronized crash of iron rang out. Every single elite sentinel of the Royal Guard immediately dropped to one knee in the snow, bowing their heads toward the crumbling outpost, pledging their lives to the woman they had once mocked. The sunset poured through the shattered ceiling, bathing Elowen in a crown of liquid gold. She stood in the center of the ruins, a woman cast out as weak, holding a rescued royal wolf, staring down at the Alpha King kneeling at her feet. Not used, Silas whispered into the stone floor, his voice thick with overwhelming emotion. Not owned, chosen. You possess the ancient magic. You are the true sovereign of this pack, Elowen Vance, and I am yours. She had stepped aside once, believing herself unworthy. She would never step aside again. The brutal reality of the frozen wastes hit Nadia Belrose, the moment the elite sentinels hurled her past the territorial markers of the Frostwood pack. The heavy iron gate slammed shut behind her, echoing with a hollow, terrifying finality that vibrated through the desolate, snow-choked canyons. She collapsed onto the jagged ice, her pristine snow leopard pelts immediately soaking up the freezing slush. The wind out here did not merely blow, it shrieked like a chorus of dying animals, whipping sharp ice crystals against her exposed skin. Her manicured hands clawed at the unforgiving frozen earth, snapping her perfectly filed nails against the permafrost. The sheer, incomprehensible humiliation of her exile burned like acid in the back of her throat. She had been the high-born Omega, the favored daughter, the one destined to stand beside the king. Instead, she had been cast out, stripped of everything, left to rot in the absolute zero of the northern ridges. Nadia dragged herself upward, her limbs trembling violently as the ambient temperature plummeted far below freezing. She refused to weep. The physical pain of the cold sinking into her bones was entirely overshadowed by the venomous, all-consuming jealousy that roiled in her stomach. Elowen, the wolfless defect, the girl who was supposed to die a pathetic, forgotten death in the arena, was now being worshipped by the very sentinels who should have executed her. Nadia wrapped her arms tightly around her chest, fighting the violent shivering that threatened to lock her muscles. She stumbled forward into the blinding whiteout, driven by a singular, obsessive purpose. She would not die quietly in the snow. She would tear the entire empire apart before she let that miserable grey-eyed peasant wear a crown. For hours, the exiled Omega pushed deeper into the jagged labyrinth of the whispering crags. The sky above turned from bruised violet to a suffocating, impenetrable pitch black. Just as the numbness in her extremities began to signal the fatal onset of frostbite, the wind shifted. It carried a scent so foul, so heavily laden with dark magic and rotting meat, that Nadia gagged, stumbling to her knees. The overwhelming stench of corrupted blood and unnatural shadow hung thick in the air, completely suffocating the natural crispness of the pine forest. She crept toward the source, her breath coming in ragged gasps, cresting a steep, snow-covered ridge that overlooked a massive gorge. Below her, nestled in a vast sunken crater of sheer rock, was the nightmare that Valen Thorn had sensed in his visions. Hundreds of corrupted rogue wolves milled about in the darkness. Their eyes glowed like scattered embers, blood-red and pitch-black, cutting through the gloom like beacons of pure malice. The snow beneath their massive, deformed paws was stained a sickly, unnatural grey by the thick, oily miasma leaking from their skin. In the centre of the encampment stood Garrick Vane. The massive rogue leader was a horrifying sight. A deep, charred crater covered his chest, where Elowen's ancient magic had struck him earlier. The flesh blackened, and still smoking faintly in the freezing air. His corrupted shadow magic hissed angrily around the wound, trying to knit the necrotic tissue back together. He was alive, and the sheer magnitude of his fury was a physical pressure that made the surrounding beasts cower in absolute silence. Nadia's breath hitched, a plume of white vapor escaping her frozen lips. A lesser wolf would have turned and run, terrified of being torn to shreds by the feral army. But her Machiavellian mind saw only an opportunity for catastrophic revenge. She had always known how to manipulate monsters. She had spent her entire life doing it in the High Court. She descended the ridge with measured, deliberate steps, ensuring her scent drifted down into the crater long before she arrived. At once, a dozen massive rogues snapped their jaws, lunging forward with guttural snarls that shook the frozen ground. Garrick let out a deafening roar that halted them in their tracks. The monstrous leader stepped forward, his pupilless black eyes locking onto the high-born Omega. He towered over her, toxic saliva dripping from his elongated fangs, the heat of his corrupted aura radiating like a sickness that made Nadia's skin crawl. "You are far from your velvet cushions, little Omega," Garrick rasped, his voice a horrifying amalgamation of grinding stones and breaking bones. "Do you offer yourself as a meal to ease the sting of my burns?" Nadia kept her chin raised, forcing her trembling knees to lock. "I offer you the one who gave you those burns," she stated coldly, her voice carrying a venom that matched his own. "I know exactly where she is, and I know she is harboring the sacred silver wolf." A ripple of vicious, hungry growls echoed through the rogue army. The royal pup, Valen Thorn, was the key to breaking the ancient wards of the Frostwood territory. Consuming a wolf of such pure lineage would grant Garrick unstoppable power, allowing his shadow-corrupted army to wash over the Empire like a plague. The rogue leader leaned down, his foul breath washing over Nadia's face, his black eyes narrowing with dangerous suspicion. "The human witch possesses a light that burns the shadow from our veins." Garrick snarled, the charred flesh on his chest cracking and oozing dark blood as he spoke. "She is guarded by King Silas and his iron sentinels." "Not anymore," Nadia lied smoothly, a cruel, triumphant smile pulling at her frozen lips. "She has separated from the king to perform a cleansing ritual on the pup. She is vulnerable. She is exhausted, but you cannot kill her with fangs alone. Her ancient magic will vaporize you before you get within striking distance." Garrick's lip curled in an ugly sneer. "Then why are you here, exile?" Nadia reached deep into the inner pockets of her heavy pelt cloak. Before her unceremonious banishment, while the royal guards were distracted by the aftermath of the arena, she had made a desperate, panicked stop at the High Council's armory. She pulled out a long, slender object wrapped in black velvet. With deliberate, reverent care, she unwrapped it, revealing a shadowed artifact. The jagged shard of iron was completely devoid of reflection. It seemed to swallow the ambient moonlight. It was coated in a thick, iridescent venom harvested from the extinct shadow stalkers of the ancient past. It pulsed with a sickening, localized cold that made the air around it shimmer with frost. "This," Nadia whispered, holding the lethal weapon out to the rogue leader, was forged to pierce ancient magical barriers. "It nullifies light magic upon contact. Trap her with this, and she will be nothing more than a fragile, wolfless girl again. I give you the weapon. I give you the coordinates of the clearing. In return, when you slaughter her and take the pup, you will leave the king to me." Garrick stared at the deadly artifact, a low, rumbling laugh building in his massive chest. He reached out with a deformed, clawed hand and snatched the weapon from her grasp. He didn't care about the Omega's petty revenge. He only cared about the slaughter and the royal blood. "Mobilize the pack!" Garrick roared to the hundreds of glowing eyes in the dark, the sound cracking like thunder across the canyon. "Tonight, we feast on royal silver and extinguish the ancient light." Miles away, deep within the heart of the remote wilderness, Elowen Vance sat in the center of an ancient, secluded clearing. She had insisted on leaving the ruined garrison. The sacred rite was not officially over until dawn, and the residual dark magic clinging to Valen Thorn's spiritual aura required the pure, unfiltered starlight of the open sky to fully cleanse. Silas had reluctantly agreed to let her go, bound by her fierce independence, though he and his elite sentinels maintained a wide, protective perimeter in the surrounding woods. The clearing was a perfect circle of crushed, pristine snow, entirely untouched by the howling winds that battered the rest of the mountain. In the center, Valen lay curled in a peaceful slumber. The royal pup's silver-grey fur shimmered softly in the darkness, his spiritual aura now a steady, brilliant mist that intertwined with the residual golden warmth radiating from Elowen's skin. The physical exertion of shattering the silver thread amulet and unleashing her magic in the ravine earlier had left her exhausted, a deep, hollow ache settling into her bones, but she remained vigilant. Her watchful gaze constantly scanned the tree line. The silence of the forest was too absolute. The natural nocturnal sounds of the mountain, the hoot of the frost owls, the rustle of the snow hares, had completely vanished, replaced by a suffocating, heavy tension. The ambient temperature in the clearing suddenly dropped, slicing through the warm pocket of air Elowen had created. The edges of the snowbank began to hiss and melt into grey, corrupted slush. The heavy scent of rotting pine and metallic blood coated the back of her throat. Elowen deliberately rose to her feet. She did not panic, she did not cry out for the king. She reached beneath her heavy grey tunic and drew her final defense. The moonstone dagger, the sacred pale blade, was carved of lunar stone, practically humming with a dormant, protective, faint silver light. It felt perfectly balanced in her grip, radiating an ancient warmth against the encroaching cold. She positioned her body squarely in front of the sleeping silver wolf, her spine straight, her breath steadying as she faced the impenetrable darkness of the trees. Then the shadows detached themselves from the timber. A massive circle of glowing, blood-red eyes materialized in the dark. The sheer number of them was staggering. The rogue pack moved with terrifying synchronized silence, stepping into the edge of the clearing. The stench of rotting meat and ozone flooded the air. The snow crunched heavily as Garrick Vane stepped forward, towering above his twisted brethren. The corrupted iron artifact was clutched tightly in his massive, clawed hand. A low, vibrating snarl echoed through the trees, snapping branches like dry twigs. Less than 50 yards away, standing on a raised granite ridge overlooking the clearing, King Silas Frostwood emerged from the shadows. The Alpha King had tracked the sudden surge of corrupted magic the moment the massive rogue army breached his outer perimeter. His elite sentinels fanned out along the ridge, their broadswords drawn, the black iron of their armor absorbing the faint starlight. Silas's golden eyes burned with absolute, volcanic fury as he took in the sight of the massive horde surrounding his fated mate. The mate bond roared in his chest, a violent kinetic demand to slaughter everything in the clearing. He gripped the pommel of his sword so hard the leather bindings cracked. He prepared to leap down into the fray. "Stop!" A shrill, desperate voice screamed over the howling wind, magically amplified to cut through the tension. Silas froze, his golden gaze snapping toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing. Stepping out from the safety of the rogue army's rear flank, protected by rows of snarling beasts, was Nadia. The exiled Omega looked utterly deranged, her hair matted with ice, her extravagant furs ruined and soaked in grey slush, but her eyes burned with a maniacal, victorious fanaticism as she taunted the Alpha King from across the battlefield. "You are too late, King Silas!" Nadia shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at him from behind the wall of corrupted wolves. "The clearing is ours. She belongs to the dark now." Silas bared his fangs, a demonic growl vibrating in his massive chest. "You dare show your face in my territory, exile? I will tear you apart myself." Garrick laughed, a sound like grinding boulders. He didn't wait for the king to strike. The massive rogue leader raised the jagged, ancient iron shard high into the air and slammed it directly into the frozen ground at Elowen's feet. In a blinding flash, a massive, impenetrable dome of thick, necrotic shadow erupted from the artifact. It exploded upward in a violent geyser of dark magic, expanding outward to seal the center of the clearing. It formed a localized, physical boundary of pure corrupted energy, an oily, hissing wall of black frost. The dome trapped Elowen and the sleeping silver pup inside with Garrick and a dozen of his most monstrous, elite rogues. The rest of the rogue army, hundreds of rabid beasts, remained outside the barrier, forming a living wall of fangs and claws between the dome and the ridge where the king stood. Nadia stood safely on the outside of the barrier, laughing maniacally from behind the rogue army's defensive line. "You cannot save her, Silas. That barrier nullifies all light magic upon contact. It cannot be breached from the outside. Let the rogues tear her apart," Silas roared, the liquid silver warmth of the mate bond turning into burning, suffocating lead. "Kill them all," he snarled to his sentinels. The elite guard surged down the granite ridge like an avalanche of black iron, clashing violently with the outer horde of rogue wolves. Silas leaped into the fray, his broadsword severing heads and limbs as he carved a brutal, bloody path straight toward the shadow barrier. He didn't care about the odds. He didn't care about the hundreds of claws tearing at his armor. He only cared about the woman trapped inside the dark dome. He reached the hissing, necrotic wall of energy and drove his blade into it with all his monstrous strength. The dark magic violently repelled him, sending a concussive shockwave up his arms that nearly dislocated his shoulders and pushed him backward into the snow. He struck it again and again and again, his golden eyes burning with absolute volcanic fury. "Elowen!" he roared, wildly hacking at the impenetrable barrier, the corrupted frost freezing the blood on his hands. But before he could shatter his sword entirely against the corruption, a sudden, sharp pressure flared through the mate bond. It wasn't panic. It wasn't a desperate plea for rescue. It was a firm, grounding wave of absolute resolve, rolling up from the center of the dark dome and wrapping tightly around Silas's racing heart. Inside the barrier, surrounded by snarling rogues, Elowen did not look terrified. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight, her grip adjusting on the hilt of the moonstone dagger. With agonizing precision, she lifted her chin and looked through the semi-translucent, swirling wall of shadow. The silver-hued depths of her vision locked directly onto Silas' burning golden gaze on the other side. The physical distance between them vanished in the psychic space of their bond. She felt his agony, his desperate, frantic urge to tear the world apart just to reach her, and she sent back a single silent command. "Hold. I would rather burn with you than freeze alone." Silas's internal voice shattered through their bond, ragged and bleeding with desperation as he slammed his massive, gauntleted fists against the barrier. "Elowen, please." She offered him a measured, infinitesimal nod. It was an acknowledgement of his devotion, but it was also a firm rejection of his rescue. She knew he could not break the ancient shadow stalker magic from the outside without destroying himself. She did not need a king to fight her battles. She had spent her entire life learning how to survive the dark alone. Silas's chest seized. He watched her stand her ground like a man watching his own heart walk out of his chest. The absolute, unadulterated agony of restraint tore through his muscles. He stopped hacking at the barrier, his heavy breaths misting in the freezing air, forcing himself to obey her silent command. He chose to trust the true sovereign of the North. With a terrifying roar of suppressed anguish, Silas turned his back on the dome and unleashed his full, unhinged fury on the remaining rogues outside, tearing them limb from limb with his bare hands. Inside the barrier, Garrick let out a deafening roar. He ripped the iron shard from the frozen ground, the dark dome remaining intact above them, and raised the venomous weapon high. The trapped elite rogues surged forward, converging on the lone woman in the snow like a tidal wave of corruption and fangs. Elowen tightened her grip on the moonstone dagger, her ancient magic flaring to life in a blinding halo of molten gold. The shockwave of her ancient aura detonated outward. It vaporized the front line of corrupted wolves upon contact, turning them into nothing but ash and bone. The ash settled over the frozen earth like black snow. The front line of the elite rogue wolves had ceased to exist, their corrupted bodies entirely vaporized by the blinding shockwave of Elowen's ancient magic. Inside the hissing, necrotic boundary of the Shadowdome, absolute silence reigned for a fraction of a second. The remaining beasts recoiled, their blood-red eyes widening in primal, unadulterated terror. They had been bred for slaughter, twisted by dark magic into fearless killing machines, but the radiant, Molten heat, radiating from the woman in the center of the clearing, bypassed their corrupted minds and struck directly at their survival instincts. Elowen did not move. She remained in place over the sleeping form of Valen Thorn, her once cloudy irises now swirling with pools of liquid gold, the moonstone dagger held in a flawless, unwavering grip. Outside the barrier, the battlefield was a chaotic symphony of tearing flesh and clashing iron, but King Silas Frostwood experienced it only as a blurred, muted background noise. His entire existence was anchored to the semi-translucent wall of black frost. Through the swirling miasma, he could see the glowing silhouette of his mate. The fated bond connected his nervous system to hers, transmitting a terrifying cascade of sensory information. He felt the extreme, blistering heat of her magic burning through her veins. He felt the agonizing strain on her untested human muscles, the microscopic tearing of fibers, the sharp taste of coppered ozone flooding her mouth. His own broadsword cleaved through the spine of a massive rogue outside the dome, but his golden eyes never left the barrier. The psychological torment of restraint was tearing his sanity apart. The Alpha King, a sovereign whose mere presence made rival empires tremble, was forced to act as a helpless spectator while the woman he was bound to face the monster alone. The young woman remained unaware the monarch could perceive through glamours. She failed to realize the sheer willpower it took for him to obey her command to stay back, and she absolutely could not have guessed that every burning breath she took inside that poisonous cage echoed violently in his own lungs. Silas gritted his teeth, his fangs elongating as a demonic snarl ripped through his throat. He crushed the skull of another attacker with his armored gauntlet, his frantic violence fueled entirely by the desperate need to keep the outer horde from reinforcing the dome. He had to trust her. He had to trust the quiet, wolfless girl who had just incinerated a dozen nightmares with a single thought. Inside the localized prison of dark magic, Garrick Vane finally broke the silence. The massive rogue leader let out a deafening, bone-rattling roar that shook the heavy snow from the surrounding pines. The charred crater on his chest wept thick, black blood, but the pain only seemed to fuel his madness. He raised the toxic iron shard high above his deformed head, the ancient shadow stalker venom dripping from its jagged edge, and hissing violently as it hit the purified earth Elowen had created. He did not care about the loss of his vanguard. He was consumed by the singular, obsessive desire to extinguish the blinding light that was causing him so much physical agony. The monstrous rogue launched himself across the clearing. The sheer velocity of his massive, corrupted frame displaced the air, creating a vacuum that sucked the remaining rogues forward in his wake. The ground trembled beneath his heavy paws. The stench of rotting pine and ozone grew suffocating, a physical pressure designed to paralyze prey. Elowen did not shrink. For 20 years, her instinct had been to lower her head, to make herself small, to absorb the cruelty of the pack without making a single sound. But remaining in the center of the dark dome, feeling the impossible, boundless warmth of her true heritage flooding her chest, the urge to hide vanished completely. She tightened her grip on the pale, humming hilt of the moonstone dagger. As the giant rogue closed the distance, his jaw unhinging to reveal rows of toxic, dripping fangs, she stepped into his attack instead of backing away. It was a maneuver that defied all logic. Silas, watching through the dark barrier, felt his heart stop entirely. Garrick brought the heavy iron shard down in a brutal, sweeping arc meant to cleave Elowen in half. She dropped to one knee, the crushed snow splashing against her shins, and brought the sacred blade up to intercept the blow. The collision of ancient Newt lunar stone and corrupted shadow iron produced a shockwave that cracked the very foundations of the clearing. A blinding explosion of conflicting energies, pitch black and incandescent gold, erupted from the point of impact. The physical force drove Elowen's boots inches deep into the permafrost. The bones in her arms screamed under the immense weight of the monstrous beast pressing down on her. The dark magic hissed and spat against her golden aura, trying desperately to find a crack in her defenses, seeking to freeze the blood in her veins. Elowen's breath hitched, her lungs burning as the toxic miasma washed over her face. Garrick leaned his massive weight into the strike, his pupilless eyes burning with Victoria's malice. He was stronger. He was heavier. He was a creature of war, and she was just a girl holding a glowing knife. But Garrick did not understand the nature of the magic he was fighting. It was not a weapon forged in anger. It was a power born of absolute, unconditional protection. As Eleven felt her muscles begin to fail, a profound, resonant vibration echoed deep within the marrow of her bones. It was a sensation of dormant gates finally swinging wide open. The hollow ache she had carried her entire life was not a void. It had been a reservoir waiting for a catalyst, and the catalyst was the desperate need to keep the sleeping pup behind her safe. A searing, localized heat bloomed on the inside of Elowen's right forearm. It was so intense that the grey fabric of her worn tunic instantly turned to ash, fluttering away to reveal her pale skin, etched into her flesh, glowing with the blinding intensity of a captured star, was a divine geometric seal of interlocking lunar phases. It was the genetic signature of the true sovereigns, the ancient magic wielders who had once fought alongside the first Alpha Kings to push back the darkness. The glowing seal pulsed in time with her racing heartbeat, flooding her exhausted muscles with a massive rush of liquid fire that tasted of victory and dawn. Outside the dome, Silas gasped, his broadsword dropping a fraction of an inch as he witnessed the impossible light flaring through the shadows. He had read the forbidden, crumbling texts hidden deep in the royal archives. He knew what that glowing mark meant. The ancient seal was not just a symbol of power. It was a declaration of absolute divine authority over the natural world. His wolf bowed its head in the dark recesses of his mind, completely subjugated by the sheer majesty of the woman he had claimed as his mate. Inside the barrier, Elowen let out a sharp, breathless cry that was not born of pain, but of total liberation. She pushed upward against the crushing weight of the shadow iron shard. The ancient magic cascaded from the glowing seal down her arm, wrapping around the moonstone dagger in a thick, swirling vortex of golden flames. The pale blade hummed with a deafening frequency. With a sudden, explosive burst of strength that defied her human frame, Elowen parried the heavy weapon aside and drove the glowing dagger directly into the center of Garrick's corrupted chest. The ancient magic did not cut flesh, it incinerated corruption. The golden light erupted inside the rogue leader's chest cavity, expanding outward with the force of a detonating star. Garrick Vane's horrific, triumphant snarl instantly turned into a high, reedy shriek of unimaginable agony. The dark, oily miasma leaking from his pores ignited, burning away the shadow stalker venom that had consumed his soul. The jagged iron shard slipped from his deformed claws, clattering uselessly against the frozen rocks. Elowen did not pull the blade out. She gripped the hilt with both hands, her storm-grey eyes locked onto the black voids of the monster's eyes, and channeled the full, terrifying weight of her ancient magic into his corrupted heart. The blinding halo of molten gold expanded, pushing the thick, necrotic walls of the Shadow Dome outward. The remaining elite rogues, trapped inside the barrier, whimpered, tucking their tails and pressing themselves flat against the hissing darkness, completely broken by the overwhelming presence of the Sovereign. They were predators, but they had just realized they were trapped in a cage with the sun. Garrick Vane's massive frame convulsed violently. The blinding light purging his system reached a critical mass, shattering the dense network of dark magic that had sustained his monstrous size. Elowen watched as the horrifying mutations receded, the twisted bones snapping back into their natural alignment with a sickening series of cracks. With a final, choked gasp that sounded like crumbling stone, the rogue leader collapsed backward onto the crushed ice. He did not disintegrate, but the shadow that had animated him was entirely extinguished, leaving behind nothing more than a lifeless wolf. The once terrifying monster was now just a lifeless creature, entirely stripped of the unnatural strength he had stolen. The moment Garrick's dark consciousness severed, the Shadow Stalker artifact, embedded into the snow, lost its power source. The massive, impenetrable dome of necrotic energy flickered violently. The oily black frost began to crack, deep fissures of golden light tearing through the surface. With a sound like 1,000 panes of glass shattering simultaneously, the dark barrier exploded outward, dissolving into harmless, grey mist that was instantly swept away by the howling mountain wind. The clearing was suddenly open to the night sky again. The sudden release of pressure sent a concussive wave across the snow, knocking the remaining rogue wolves off their feet. Stripped of their leader and their magical protection, the surviving beasts looked at the glowing woman standing over Garrick's fallen body and made their choice. They broke. Whimpering in absolute terror, the remnants of the rogue army turned their tails and fled into the dark tree line, abandoning the Frostwood territory in a frantic, disorganized stampede. Silas and his elite sentinels did not pursue them. The battle was over. The royal guards remained frozen on the edges of the clearing, their black iron armor covered in the dark blood of their enemies, their breath plumbing in the freezing air. Their eyes, wide with disbelief and awe, were fixed entirely on Elowen Vance. Elowen remained in the center of the battlefield, the moonstone dagger hanging loosely from her fingertips. The glowing seal on her forearm continued to pulse with a steady, rhythmic cadence, casting long, dramatic shadows across the pristine snow. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as the massive surge of adrenaline began to ebb. Her thin grey tunic was torn and scorched, her hands bruised, but she had never looked more powerful. She kept her gaze averted from the Alpha King. She ignored the sentinels lowering their weapons. Her entire focus immediately snapped back to the small silver-grey form lying in the snow behind her. Valen Thorn was still asleep, but the collapse of the dark dome had violently disrupted the delicate cleansing ritual. The sudden shift in atmospheric magic caused the pup to whimper, a high, pained sound that cut through the silence in the Whisper Spring crags like a physical blade. The dark, necrotic energy from Garrick's weapon had seeped into the ground, creeping toward the defenseless royal heir, threatening to corrupt the pure silver aura that surrounded his small body. Elowen dropped to her knees. The impact sent a sharp jolt of pain up her legs, but she ignored it. The frozen earth bit through the fabric of her trousers, a stark contrast to the burning heat still coursing through her veins. She shoved the dagger back into her boot and reached out with both hands, placing her trembling palms firmly against Valen's matted fur. The hollow ache in her chest warned her that her reserves were dangerously low. Unleashing the ancient magic to destroy Garrick had drained nearly all of her stored power. To channel any more energy was to risk pulling from her own life force. Her physical body, still largely human and frail compared to the ancient entity she housed, was beginning to violently protest the strain. The microscopic tearing in her muscles burned like acid. But Elowen did not hesitate. The maternal protective instinct that had driven her into the Whispering Crags demanded absolute sacrifice. She would not let the royal pup die, not when she finally had the power to save him. "I am here," she whispered, her voice a raw, melodic rasp that carried clearly across the quiet snow. She closed her eyes, ignoring the burning protests of her muscles, and pushed the absolute last vestiges of her golden warmth into the pup. The connection was instantaneous. The glowing seal on her arm flared one final, blinding time, transferring a torrent of pure liquid gold directly into Valen's spiritual aura. The physical sensation was overwhelming. Elowen felt as though she were pouring her own heartbeat into the wolf, a profound, intimate tethering of souls that tasted of crushed embers and falling snow. Then, the impossible happened. Valen Thorn's small, injured body began to absorb the golden light, not merely healing, but expanding. The luminescent silver mist surrounding him thickened, swirling violently like a localized blizzard of pure starlight. The transformation was not silent. The sharp, electric crackle of localized ozone filled the clearing, overpowering everything else. The heavy, suffocating stench of rotting pine and shadow stalker venom that had choked the Frostwood territory just moments ago was instantly overwritten by the crisp, biting scent of fresh pine needles and crushed frost. The starlight caught against Elowen's pale skin, painting her bruised and exhausted face in strokes of celestial brilliance. It was a baptism of light. The sheer concentration of pure energy forced the surrounding air to drop in temperature, not with the biting cold of winter, but with the cool, pristine stillness of the high cosmos. Outside the perimeter of the magic, Silas felt the monumental shift through the tether of the mate bond. His own chest tightened, a massive physical pressure bearing down against his ribs, as though the gravity of the clearing had suddenly multiplied. The air grew impossibly thin, heavy with the divine resonance of a deity waking from a 1,000-year slumber. He gasped, his lungs burning, the sheer, overwhelming majesty of the energy radiating from the epicenter forced his inner wolf to drop completely flat within his mind, whining in absolute reverence. The pup's physical form grew rapidly, the bones cracking and shifting in a divine, painless metamorphosis. The silver fur lengthened, shimmering with an ethereal, metallic sheen, paws the size of boulders pressed into the permafrost, melting the ice instantly upon contact. Silas took a hesitant step forward, his broadsword slipping from his slackened grip and hitting the snow with a dull thud. The Alpha King's golden eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated shock. He recognized the energy signature. It was not just a royal pup anymore. The silver mist exploded outward, washing over Elowen in a gentle, warm wave. Standing before her was no longer a defenseless child, but a massive, towering entity of pure spiritual majesty. The wolf was larger than any Lycan in existence, its coat spun from moonlight, its eyes glowing with the deep ancient wisdom of the cosmos. It breathed, and the sound was the rushing of a mighty, ancient river. It was the legendary guardian spirit of the Frostwood Pack, the divine protector that had not manifested in the physical realm since the first age of the Lycan Empire. Valen Thorn had never been just a pup. He was the chosen vessel for the ancient deity, waiting for the touch of the true sovereign to awaken. The giant, ethereal wolf lowered its massive head, the air around it vibrating with a deep, resonant hum that settled the turbulent magic of the clearing. It did not roar or bare its teeth. Instead, it gently pressed its cool, silver snout against Elowen's bruised forehead. In that moment of divine contact, the lingering golden magic in the air coalesced. The ambient starlight fractured, weaving together in a brilliant, tangible ring of light that descended slowly from the freezing sky. The ethereal artifact settled perfectly upon Elowen's dark hair, glowing with the combined brilliance of the sun and the moon. A crown of pure starlight. It was not forged of gold or iron, but of pure, crystallized magic. It radiated a warmth so profound that the winter chill was banished entirely from the clearing. The crown marked the absolute, undeniable truth of her bloodline. She was not a wolfless defect. She was not a weak, disposable omega. She was the chosen arbiter of the guardian spirit, the divine ruler whose authority superseded any earthly king. The silence in the whispering crags was absolute. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath in reverence. King Silas Frostwood stood utterly paralyzed, a man trapped between the immense weight of his own regret and the blinding reality of the present. Every rigid belief he had ever held, every strict interpretation of the ancient laws that governed the Frostwood arena, fractured into 1,000 meaningless pieces under the weight of her celestial glow. He had watched her be mocked. He had listened to the vicious whispers of his pack as they tore at her dignity. And he had done nothing, chained by a cold, archaic tradition that dictated the Alpha King, did not intervene in the trials. He stared at the woman he had allowed to walk into a slaughter. The sheer magnitude of his blindness struck him with the physical force of a bludgeoned chest. Elowen had never needed his protection. She had never been the fragile creature he had assumed her to be. She possessed an ocean of power, ancient and untamed, yet she had chosen the hardest path of all, silence. She had absorbed the humiliation without shedding a single tear, her head bowed not in submission, but in a quiet, terrifying restraint. The realization ripped through him like a blade through silk. The mate bond connecting their souls snapped into a new, terrifyingly deep configuration. The golden thread tying his heart to hers thickened, turning into an unbreakable cable of pure, unadulterated devotion. The recognition was entirely physical, a heavy, crushing weight that forced the icy air from his lungs. His inner beast, the violent, dominant predator that demanded absolute submission from the entire world, went completely still. It did not just recognize a mate, it recognized its master. Silas's chest he heaved. The cold winter air tasted of his own profound failure. He watched her inhale, feeling the precise rhythm of her breath echoing in his own ribcage. The warmth radiating from the starlight crown brushed against his frostbitten skin, an unearned comfort that made his golden eyes burn with the sudden frantic urge to fall to the earth, to kneel to beg for a forgiveness he knew he did not deserve. The Alpha King, a monarch who ruled with iron and blood, suddenly felt incredibly small beneath the shadow of her divine sovereignty. Behind the king, The atmospheric pressure in the clearing shifted dramatically. A synchronized heavy clanking of metal echoed through the snowy expanse. One by one, without a single command being issued by their sovereign, the elite sentinels of the Royal Guard dropped to their knees in the crushed snow. They moved in perfect, awe-struck unison, their heads bowing low, pressing their armored fists over their hearts in the deepest, most sacred gesture of lichened submission. They were no longer swearing fealty to the Alpha King. They were offering their lives, their souls, and their eternal loyalty to the woman wearing the crown of pure starlight. Eluan did not gloat. She did not raise her voice to demand their worship. The giant ethereal wolf remained by her side, a towering monument of silver light, but she merely kept her hands folded in front of her torn tunic, her posture radiating a quiet, unshakable grace. But the profound, sacred silence was abruptly shattered by a piercing, hysterical shriek. Nadia Belrose. She had cowered behind the safety of the rocky outcrops on the upper ridge while the slaughter unfolded, terrified of the very forces she had allied with. But now she was being forcefully dragged forward by two towering sentinels. Her luxurious, pristine furs were stained with soot, mud, and her own frantic sweat. Her face, usually a mask of entitled arrogance, was twisted into an ugly, desperate snarl of denial. "Let me go, it is an illusion," Nadia shrieked, thrashing violently against the heavy iron grips of the guards. She pointed a trembling, clawed finger toward the glowing woman in the center of the clearing. "You saw it, King Silas. That is dark witchcraft. She is no sovereign. She lured the rogues here to stage a coup. She is the traitor. It's a trick." Eluan did not flinch. She did not defend herself. Standing beside the towering ethereal form of the guardian spirit, she merely lowered her chin, her glacial stare washing over Nadia with absolute chilling indifference. Her silence was absolute, heavier, and far more damning than any defensive plea. Silas did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Slowly the Alpha King turned his head. The transition in the atmosphere was instantaneous and violent. The temperature in the clearing, previously warmed by the divine starlight, plummeted to absolute zero around him. The sheer, suffocating pressure of his alpha aura rolled outward, a physical wall of dominance and unhinged fury that slammed into Nadia, forcing her to her knees in the crushed snow. The sheer gravity of his presence cracked the ice beneath her boots. "Treason," Silas said. The single word thundered through the clearing like a war drum. Nadia gasped, clawing at her own throat as the air was forcefully sucked from her lungs. "My king, please. I only wanted to protect the crown." "You broke your exile," Silas continued, his voice a low, lethal rumble that vibrated the very stones of the shadowy gorge. Every syllable was laced with the poisonous sting of his own self-hatred, projected entirely onto the woman who had tormented his mate. "I spared your life at the garrison, stripping you of your rank and ordering you to leave my lands on pain of death. And yet you returned. You broke your exile to bring monsters to our gates. You handed the Shadow Stalker shard to a rogue to assassinate the true sovereign and my royal heir." Nadia began to weep openly, her arrogance entirely shattered by the crushing weight of the Alpha's decree. The trial laws forbade intervention. You yourself obeyed them. You didn't step in when she was attacked. I was only upholding the natural order." Her words hit Silas like a physical blow, a direct strike to his most profound vulnerability, but his expression remained carved from winter itself. He stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching against the ice until he loomed over her cowering form. "High treason carries only one penalty," he stated, his golden eyes glowing with a terrifying, unhinged fury. "A swift execution. But a swift death is a mercy you have not earned, Nadia." Nadia wailed, her hands scrambling frantically against the frozen earth, tearing her perfectly manicured nails against the permafrost until they bled. "No, you cannot do this. I belong to the High Court. You belong to the dirt now," Silas finished, his voice as cold and final as the grave. "Drag her to the lowest levels of the royal dungeons. She will spend the rest of her miserable life breaking rocks in the silver mines, starved of the moonlight, stripped of her wolf, and entirely forgotten by the empire she tried to destroy. Take her." The sentinels did not hesitate. They hoisted the shrieking, thrashing woman by her arms and dragged her violently backward through the deep, unforgiving snow. Her hysterical sobs echoed into the frozen night, rapidly fading as they hauled her toward the brutal, lightless prison from which no traitor ever returned. Then there was only silence again. Silas stood alone in the aftermath, his broadsword forgotten in the snow, staring back at the breathtaking, terrifying beauty of his fated mate. The woman he had watched be mocked. The woman he had allowed to walk into danger, because he was too rigidly bound by the laws of his ancestors. She remained in the center of the battlefield, flanked by an ancient god, wearing a crown of starlight, radiating a quiet, unbreakable dignity. Because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome, she had simply changed the entire world instead. Elowen slowly opened her eyes. The molten gold in her irises had settled into a calm, infinite storm grey. She directed no attention toward the kneeling sentinels. She did not look at the king. She looked forward, her expression an impenetrable mask of solemn grace. She had survived the dark, and she had done it completely alone. The heavy, suffocating silence that settled over the whispering crags was absolute, disturbed only by the distant, mournful howling of the winds pushing through the northern ridges, and the sharp crackle of melting ice. Nadia Belrose's hysterical screams had long since faded into the dark, swallowed entirely by the unforgiving vastness of the mountain. The clearing, once a pristine sanctuary of untouched winter snow, was now a scarred battlefield of blackened ash, scorched earth, and deep jagged fissures leaking residual dark magic. Yet at the epicenter of the destruction, a profound celestial stillness radiated outward. Elowen Vance stood bathed in the ethereal glow of the crown of pure starlight resting upon her brow. Her breathing was measured and entirely unbothered by the freezing atmospheric pressure that usually dominated the high-altitude territory. The delicate silver thread amulet she had worn for years lay in shattered fragments beneath the snow, its suppression magic completely broken. Beside her, the moonstone dagger gleamed with a faint, residual light, having fulfilled its sacred purpose against the shadows. King Silas Frostwood remained frozen near the edge of the shattered shadow dome. The Alpha King, a man who had conquered entire rebel armies and ruled the Lycan Empire with an iron fist, found himself completely paralyzed by the sheer, crushing weight of his own profound failure. The fated mate bond, a golden, pulsating thread connecting his very soul to hers, was vibrating so violently in his chest that it threatened to crack his ribs with every erratic heartbeat. Through the tether, he felt her deep physical exhaustion. He felt the microscopic tears in her human muscles from channeling the ancient magic and the sharp taste of copper flooding her mouth. But more devastatingly, he felt her absolute, impenetrable emotional distance. She was entirely self-sufficient. She did not need him, and the realization was a physical poison in his veins. Silas forced his heavy armored boots to move. The sound of his iron soles crushing the permafrost echoed loudly in the quiet clearing. He did not walk directly toward his mate. Instead, his glowing amber eyes caught the dull, unnatural gleam of an object half buried in the soot and grey slush where Garrick Vane, the monstrous rogue leader, had fallen. The monarch knelt, the thick leather of his trousers groaning in protest against the cold, and reached into the corrupted snows. His thick, leather-clad fingers closed around a heavy disc of jagged black iron. He pulled it free, brushing away the toxic ash to reveal the intricate, interlocking crest of his own High Council. It was the broken royal seal, the physical key to the deepest, most secure vaults of his armory, an artifact forged in ancient times to symbolize pack unity. It had been fractured down the middle, undoubtedly cracked, when Nadia used it to bypass the ancient wards and steal the Shadowstalker shard. The realization of the betrayal hit the man with the force of a battering ram. The conspiracy was not just the frantic act of a jealous traitor. It was a systemic failure of his entire court. He remembered the faces of the elders who had sworn loyalty to him, realizing they were all complicit. The very edicts he had rigidly hidden behind when Elowen was attacked had been weaponized by the council to orchestrate her assassination. A low, guttural snarl of pure self-hatred ripped through the Alpha's throat. His massive hand tightened around the heavy iron disc, his muscles bulging under his armor as he squeezed with terrifying, unhinged fury. The sharp, jagged edges of the fractured crest bit deeply through the reinforced leather of his gauntlet, slicing directly into his palm. Warm, thick blood welled up, dripping steadily onto the pristine snow, a bright, startling crimson against the pale earth. He welcomed the physical pain. It was a fleeting, insignificant sting compared to the agonizing, hollow ache tearing through his chest as he realized how long Elwyn must have suffered under those cruel laws while he sat blindly on his throne. He stood up and turned to face the woman he had wronged. The physical distance between them was less than 20 yards, but it felt like an insurmountable chasm spanning centuries. He reached up with his bleeding hand and unclasped the heavy wolf fur mantle from his shoulders, letting it drop carelessly into the slush. Next, he unbuckled the thick leather straps of his broadsword, tossing the legendary weapon aside. The steel clattered against the rocks, a harsh, metallic sound of absolute surrender. Piece by piece, Silas stripped himself of his royal armor. He unlatched the heavy iron pauldrons, disgusted by the intricate engravings that now represented a false, hollow honor. The spiked gauntlets and the reinforced chestplate followed, discarding the protective layers that had defined his entire adult life. He threw them aside until he stood in the freezing mountain air, wearing nothing but a dark, sweat-soaked tunic. The biting cold of the winter equinox immediately sank its teeth into his exposed skin, raising goosebumps over the thick silver scars that mapped his torso. He had fought 100 territorial wars to protect a pack that was secretly poisoning itself from the inside. His rigid adherence to ancient laws had nearly cost him the only soul that mattered. Now the frigid air was a punishment he gladly accepted. The searing, liquid heat of the mate bond burned fiercely in his veins, keeping him tethered to the physical plane, creating a painful dichotomy of burning inside and freezing outside. He began to walk toward Elwyn. His golden eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely stripped of their usual dominant authority. He was not approaching as a ruler demanding compliance. He was approaching as a broken man, seeking the grace of a deity. But before he could close the distance, the atmospheric pressure in the clearing shifted violently. A massive shadow moved, blocking the ambient starlight. Valen Thorn's royal lineage and powerful spiritual aura triggered the ultimate awakening of ancient magic. From the pup's profound transformation, the ancient guardian spirit, Aurelius, fully materialized and stepped deliberately into Silas's path. The giant silver wolf's spirit was a monument of terrifying divine majesty. Its coat, spun from liquid moonlight and ancient magic, shimmered with localized constellations, making the beast look like a miniature galaxy pulled down to earth. The creature lowered its massive head, its glowing, cosmos-filled eyes locking directly onto the Alpha King. A deep, resonant hum vibrated from the beast's chest, a warning growl that shook the loose stones from the surrounding ridges, sending vibrations deep into the frozen earth. The air around the animal warped, shimmering with intense gravitational force. Silas felt a psychic pressure pressing directly against his frontal lobe, a flood of memories from ancient times washing over him, showing him exactly how far his pack had strayed from the true path of the moon goddess. The deity was evaluating him, stripping away his earthly titles and looking directly at his soul. Aurelius was fiercely, uncompromisingly protective of the woman who had saved his physical vessel's life, and the guardian spirit would not allow the man who had stood by and watched her bleed to come a single step closer. Silas halted. Any other alpha would have met the challenge with a display of dominance, baring fangs and projecting their aura to force the animal into submission. But he did not push forward. He did not issue a command. He looked at the massive silver wolf, recognizing the divine barrier between his past mistakes and his future, and he accepted his judgment entirely. Silence. Deliberately, the king sank to the earth. He dropped to both knees, the impact sending a sharp, jarring pain up his shins. He bowed his dark head, his broad shoulders trembling under the immense, crushing weight of his emotional agony. He pressed his bleeding, bare hands flat against the freezing permafrost, exposing the vulnerable nape of his neck in the ultimate irreversible posture of lichen groveling. "I was blind," Silas rasped, his voice tearing out of his throat like crushed glass, loud enough to carry over the wind to where Elwyn stood. "I let the fear of a fractured empire bind my hands, while my fated mate fought a war I should have ended. I watched them mock you. I watched you bleed on the arena ice. And I did nothing. The elite sentinels of the royal guard, still kneeling in the snow on the periphery of the clearing, kept their heads bowed in profound, respectful silence. Witnessing the absolute submission of their alpha was a monumental, historic event, but none dared to interrupt the sacred reckoning between true mates. "The council used the artifact to try and erase you," he continued, his voice breaking as a single hot tear carved a path down his freezing cheek, splashing onto the ice below. "My own laws were weaponized to destroy you. The system I swore to protect is entirely corrupted. I do not ask for your forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I only ask for the mercy of spending the rest of my miserable life protecting your shadow. They wanted to cage you, to break your spirit so you would fit their mold. I will burn the entire kingdom to the ground before I allow that to happen again. Command me, my queen, and I will tear this empire down to the bedrock and build it anew in your name." The silence that followed his confession was heavy, laden with the scent of cedar, blood, and ozone. The woman did not immediately answer. She stood behind the massive, protective bulk of Aurelius, her storm-grey eyes watching the kneeling man with a quiet, impenetrable sorrow. His capacity for such raw, unshielded vulnerability caught her completely off guard. She possessed no inkling that the sight of his broad shoulders shaking with silent sobs would send a sharp, sympathetic ache echoing through the golden thread of their bond, and she was completely uncertain if she was ready to trust the warmth he offered. Not when the memory of the freezing arena ice and the taste of her own blood were still so fresh in her mind. For 20 years, every breath she took had been shallow, restricted by the fear of drawing attention, choked by the freezing magic of her suppressor talisman. Now her lungs expanded fully. She felt the ambient magic of the crags flowing through her like a living river. She connected with the roots of the ancient pines, the deep, shifting tectonic plates beneath the ice. She was finally one with the mountain. The bitter chill of the winter winds no longer possessed the power to make her tremble. The suffocating weight of being an Omega, a supposedly weak and wolfless member of a society that valued brute force above all else, evaporated into the starlit sky. In its place was a profound, unshakable strength. She had faced Garrick Vane, a monstrous rogue empowered by forbidden dark magic, and she had destroyed him completely on her own. She had survived the abyss, and the light radiating from her core was the ultimate quiet proof of her unbroken endurance. Elowen stepped out from behind the giant silver wolf. Aurelius shifted slightly, allowing her to pass, but kept his massive glowing eyes fixed warily on the king. She closed the remaining distance, her worn boots leaving shallow prints in the snow, until she stood merely a foot away from him. The ambient heat radiating from the crown of pure starlight upon her head washed over his shivering frame, offering him a momentary, tantalizing glimpse of the sanctuary he so desperately craved. She looked down at him. There was no triumph in her expression, no vindictive pleasure in seeing the most powerful man in the world reduced to a weeping beggar at her feet. There was only a solemn, devastating clarity. Gradually, she raised her right hand, extending her palm toward the night sky. The lingering ancient magic in the atmosphere responded instantly. The ambient starlight fractured, spiraling downward in a brilliant, blinding vortex of silver and gold energy. The light coalesced in her grasp, solidifying into a physical, tangible object. When the blinding flash receded, she held the starlight staff. It was a magnificent, towering rod carved from raw lunar stone, pulsing with a steady, heartbeat-like rhythm. The crystal embedded at its peak glowed with a pure, unadulterated brilliance that entirely banished the remaining shadows from the clearing. It was not just a weapon, it was the physical manifestation of her unyielding will, the ultimate, irrefutable symbol of her independent authority, a divine mandate that required no king, no council, and no archaic laws to validate. She grounded the base of the staff against the permafrost. The impact sent a gentle cleansing ripple of warm magic outward, melting the last remnants of corrupted ash from the snow. "You obeyed your laws," Eowyn spoke, her voice a calm, melodic hum that resonated perfectly in the quiet night. It carried no anger, only the heavy, immutable weight of truth. You prioritized the stability of your throne over the life of an Omega you deemed insignificant. You made your choice. "I was a coward," Silas whispered to the ground, his voice choked with agony, his hands curling into fists against the freezing earth. I was a fool, perhaps, she replied softly, looking out over the jagged, snow-covered peaks of the northern ridges. The winter equinox mating trials were supposed to be the beginning of everything. Instead, this trial became the moment the old world shattered. I learned to survive the winter without you. I learned to face the darkness alone. I found the ancient magic hidden in my own veins. A truth unspoken for 20 years grows teeth, my king, and tonight the queen of ancient magic has finally bitten back. I did not need a monarch to save me. I only needed myself. He closed his eyes, the physical pain of her words twisting in his chest like a serrated blade. He wanted to reach out. He wanted to wrap his arms around her knees and bury his face in the fabric of her torn tunic to absorb her scent and beg until his vocal cords snapped. But he remained perfectly still, honoring the physical boundary she had established. He was a protector in the truest sense. He would rather suffer in the agony of distance than force his touch upon a mate who had not freely offered it. I am not returning to the pack house, Elowen declared, the finality in her tone echoing like a gavel striking stone. I am not returning to a court that orchestrated my death and mocked my existence. My domain is the untamed north. I will rule from the mountains, and I will protect the innocent who are cast out by your rigid, broken laws. Silas lifted his head, his glowing amber eyes, swimming with unshed tears, met her calm, storm-grey gaze. The realization of what she was saying settled over him, crushing the last desperate spark of hope in his chest. She was rejecting his immediate plea. She was choosing independence over the comfort of the fetid bond. The pack house was a monument to alpha dominance, a place where she would be expected to be a compliant consort, a decorative piece in a gilded cage. She was a storm, and she refused to be confined again. "You are leaving me," he breathed, the words barely more than an exhalation of pure devastation. "I am choosing myself," she corrected gently. Her hand tightened around the humming shaft of the crystal-topped weapon. The fated bond is a tether. It is not a shackle. Some wounds could only be healed with love, but true love requires absolute trust. Trust must be built from the ashes of the old world, not demanded as a genetic right. He stared at her, the golden thread connecting their souls vibrating with a melancholic, achingly beautiful resonance. He understood. He finally understood the true nature of his mate. She was not a prize to be claimed, nor a fragile creature to be sheltered from the world. She was a queen in her own right, forged in the fires of isolation and betrayal. She demanded absolute respect, and she would accept nothing less. "Then I will wait," Silas vowed, his voice dropping to a fierce, vibrating register of absolute, unbreakable devotion. He did not rise from his knees. He looked up at her with a terrifying, unyielding loyalty burning in his eyes. "I will return to Frostwood. I will tear down the High Council. I will shatter the proving rings. I will strip the traitors of their wolves and banish them to the deep mines. I will cleanse this territory with fire if I must, and I will spend every waking moment making the Empire a place worthy of your grace. I will build a sanctuary open to the sky, fit for a queen of ancient magic, and I will wait, whether it takes a year, a decade, or a century. I will wait at the edge of the mountains until you are ready to let me in." Her expression softened, just a fraction. For the first time since the trials began, a genuine, infinitesimally small smile touched the corners of her lips. It was not a promise, but it was a beginning, a quiet acknowledgement of the monumental shift in his soul. "We shall see," she murmured. The woman turned away. She never glanced behind her. With the towering rod in her hand and the crown upon her head, she began to walk toward the treacherous, snow-covered paths of the northern ridges. Aurelius, the giant ethereal spirit, immediately fell into step beside her, his massive form providing a warm, protective barrier against the rising wind. Without a single word being spoken, the sentinels rose from the snow. They did not look toward their former alpha for permission. Their allegiance had irreversibly shifted. They fell into a perfect disciplined formation behind Elowen, their black iron armor, blending into the shadows as they followed her into the wilderness. Silas remained kneeling in the freezing slush, the biting cold clawed at his exposed skin, but the external agony was entirely eclipsed by the catastrophic internal rupture happening within his chest. As Elowen's glowing silhouette moved further away, the fated mate bond, that golden pulsating thread woven directly into his soul, pulled dangerously taut. The physical strain of the connection stretching to its absolute limits was blinding. It felt as though a serrated iron hook had been buried deeply beneath his ribs, dragging his organs toward the tree line with every deliberate step she took. The temperature contrast was maddening, a brutal punishment he endured in absolute silence. On the outside, the savage winter winds whipped mercilessly across his bare, scarred chest, icing the blood that still trickled from his ruined palm and freezing his sweat into a brittle, agonizing second skin. Yet on the inside the bond burned with an agonizing liquid heat. It was a river of molten gold trapped within his freezing ribcage, searing his lungs, demanding that he rise, demanding that he abandon his pride and chase her into the dark. His wolf clawed frantically at the walls of his mind, howling in pure primal terror at the physical separation, but Silas forced his knees deeper into the permafrost, the ice biting into his joints. He swallowed the blood rising in the back of his throat. He would not chase her. He would not violate the sacred boundary she had just drawn. He anchored himself to the frozen earth, letting the golden thread stretch until it felt like his very soul was cracking down the middle, absorbing the excruciating pain as his rightful penance. The forest itself seemed to bow to her departure, reacting to the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of her ancient magic. As she stepped into the dense tree line, the colossal, snow-laden pine branches groaned heavily overhead. The massive trunks shifted, the wood protesting with sharp, cracking sounds as the ancient pines physically moved to part like a grand archway for their true sovereign. The deep, rumbling sound of the ancient wood bending echoed through the ancient canyon, a primitive, solemn symphony of natural submission. The ambient air grew impossibly thick with the sharp, intoxicating scent of burnt pine needles and crackling ozone, the lingering sensory signature of her profound awakening. The residual dark magic that had poisoned the clearing was entirely neutralized, replaced by the warm, atmospheric hum of her retreating light. The snow beneath her boots did not simply melt. It transformed into glowing, crystalline frost that illuminated her path into the endless dark. Silas watched, the ethereal glow of the crown of pure starlight bobbing through the dense thicket, flanked by the massive shifting shadow of the guardian spirit, Aurelius. The wind howled, a mournful dirge rushing down from the northern ridges, violently sweeping the scent of cedar and rain away from him. He inhaled desperately, his chest heaving as he tried to capture the last trace of her presence before the brutal winter erased it entirely. The liquid fire of the bond continued to throb, an endless, hollow ache reminding him of the vast, terrifying emptiness that now defined his existence. He had survived the physical battle against Garrick Vane's rogue army, but sitting in the deafening silence of the ruined clearing, shivering violently as the cold finally penetrated his bones. The king realized the true war for his redemption had only just begun. He would build a sanctuary from the ruins of his empire. He would earn the right to stand beside her, no matter how many lifetimes it required. The ancient magic had been awakened, and the true ruler of the Lycan Empire had finally claimed her throne. She had stepped aside once, believing herself unworthy. She would never step aside again. Elowen Vance, the Omega who accepted rejection without a single tear, had become the undeniable force that brought an entire corrupt kingdom to its knees. Thank you for listening to this story. If her journey of silent endurance, fierce independence, and ultimate triumph touched your heart, please let me know. Where are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments and discuss the true meaning of strength. Did the king grovel enough to begin his redemption? Your thoughts mean the world to me, and if you want to hear more epic tales of fated mates, hidden magic, and absolute devotion, make sure to subscribe and join our pack. Until next time, stay strong and never let them silence your light.